The encounter. Bella Davis hadn't always known struggle. At one point, life had been simpler. But the world had a way of changing. Growing up in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Bella had been taught to survive. Her parents, both hardworking individuals, never let their circumstances define them. They taught her that respect was earned, not handed out. That integrity could never be bought, no matter the price. These lessons became her foundation, and with them, Bella learned to navigate a world that often saw her for little more than the color of her skin. Today, at 40, Bella wasn't the naive woman she had once been. She had encountered countless setbacks, bruises, and barriers, but none of it had broken her. In fact, it had forged something in her, an inner fire that had only grown hotter with each injustice she'd faced. She wasn't some victim of circumstances. She was a woman of resolve, of quiet power. And today, she was walking into the grand doors of Orion Towers Hotel, a place that stood as the epitome of everything she had been denied. The opulent lobby stood in stark contrast to Bella's modest appearance. The marble floors reflected the bright chandeliers overhead, each corner of the room adorned with art that spoke of untouchable wealth. Guests in expensive suits and elegant dresses sauntered by, their lives as polished as the surface beneath their feet. But for Bella, the hotel represented much more than luxury. It was a battleground where she would demand to be seen, where she would force the world to acknowledge her. She was tired of being overlooked. Tired of walking through life as though she didn't belong. Bella had lived long enough to know that some places weren't meant for people like her. But the lesson she had learned over the years was simple: the only way to make space for yourself was to demand it. With a quick glance at the front desk, Bella noticed the young receptionist, Jason, staring at his screen, oblivious to the world around him. Her determination surged, and without hesitation, she walked up to him, her steps echoing louder than usual in the silent, pristine lobby. The receptionist glanced up and didn't bother hiding his judgment. Bella was in shabby clothes, a faded hoodie, well-worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. She knew exactly what he saw: a black woman from the streets, far beneath the kind of clientele this hotel entertained. A quiet sneer crossed his face, but he didn't say a word as he continued to tap at his keyboard. "I need a room," Bella said, her voice steady but tinged with the urgency of someone who had been knocked down one too many times and was finally standing tall. Jason barely looked up. "The best room," she added, her gaze unwavering. Jason let out a sarcastic chuckle, still tapping away on his keyboard. "Yeah, right. Let me guess, got enough money for a room like that? Or are you just gonna hang out in the lobby like some kind of tourist?" His tone was dismissive, almost mocking. Bella felt the familiar sting of being judged, but this time, it didn't break her. She wasn't some stranger asking for pity. "I don't need you to decide for me," Bella replied, her voice firm, each word precise. "I'll pay for whatever room I need. I'm not here to argue about my worth." Jason finally tore his gaze away from his screen to look at her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, lingering with judgment. "Lady, you're out of your league here. You don't belong in a place like this." The sting was sharper than Bella expected. But she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse, and she was done with letting people's assumptions define her. She would take what she came for. Before she could respond, another voice cut in. This one was colder, more authoritative. "What seems to be the problem here?" Eliza's voice carried an unmistakable authority as she approached, her heels clicking on the polished floors. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a sharp black suit that fit perfectly with the luxury surrounding them. There was something calculated in the way she moved, as though everything around her was meant to fall into place with precision. Jason didn't seem fazed by her sudden presence. "This woman wants the best room, but I doubt she has the funds for it," he said, almost too eager to explain the situation. Eliza turned her gaze toward Bella, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just took in Bella's appearance. Bella could feel the manager's gaze, a silent assessment that wasn't lost on her. Eliza's expression was unreadable, but Bella could tell that she was sizing her up, making a mental judgment based on appearances. "Do you even have enough money for that?" Eliza asked, her voice cool and detached. Bella's temper flared, but she controlled it. "I don't need you to ask that question. You're assuming things about me that you don't know." Eliza raised an eyebrow, her posture stiffening. "Listen, I don't care about your sob story. This hotel is not a place for just anyone to waltz in and demand service. If you're not going to respect the rules, I suggest you leave before security makes you." Her words were sharp, as though she relished the power in them, in the control that came with her position. Bella didn't back down, not this time. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, eyes locked onto Eliza. "Not without the room I came for. You don't get to decide who belongs here." Jason chuckled again, and Eliza's gaze darkened as she glanced at him. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling the security guards stationed nearby. The two men moved toward Bella, their expressions unreadable, yet their presence heavy and intimidating. Bella's heartbeat quickened, but she didn't back away. This wasn't the first time she had been pushed aside, this time, she wouldn't let it go. "I have money, and I will stay here," she stated, her voice steady, her resolve unshakable. But before she could protest further, the security guards moved in, guiding her toward the door. Her body tensed, but she didn't resist. Bella could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, some with pity, others with indifference. The final indignity. Being forcibly escorted out of the Grand Hotel, the very place where she had planned to stand her ground. As the heavy doors swung shut behind her, Bella took a deep breath, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She wouldn't be forgotten. She would return. And when she did, the world would know who she was, not as they wanted to see her, but as she truly was, strong, determined, and unstoppable. The secret. Bella's steps were slow but deliberate as she walked away from the hotel. The wind caught her jacket, but she barely noticed, her mind still racing from the humiliation she'd just endured. The feeling of being dismissed so casually, reduced to nothing more than a stereotype to be discarded, burned deep in her chest. For years, she had fought the internal battle of proving her worth to a world that constantly tried to define her by its own narrow standards. But today, something had shifted inside her. This time, it wasn't just about money, or prestige, or fitting into some predefined box. It was about respect. Her respect. Her right to exist and to claim what she had worked so hard for. Bella had been walking for hours since she'd been thrown out of the hotel. Her head buzzed with thoughts of how the world treated people like her, people who weren't wealthy, who didn't fit the mold of what others expected. She passed through the city streets, her eyes scanning the faces of those around her, some lost in their own worlds, others simply passing through, oblivious to the struggles of people who had to fight for their place in it. She wasn't angry, though. No, this was something more profound, a quiet determination that had been building inside her for years. She stopped for a moment at the edge of a park, taking in the view of the skyline. The Orion Towers, with its towering glass and steel structure, stood like a monolith in the distance, reminding her of the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be. It wasn't just the physical space, it was the psychological divide that kept people like her from stepping into spaces that were reserved for the elite. Bella had been to many places, faced many obstacles. But today felt different. She would not let this humiliation define her. She would return, and when she did, she would make them see her, not as a threat, but as a force to be reckoned with. Back at the hotel, Eliza was running her usual shift, attending to the tasks that came with managing a place like Orion Towers. The day had gone by without incident, but Eliza's thoughts kept returning to the encounter with Bella. It had left an unusual impression on her. One that she couldn't shake off, no matter how hard she tried. As the hotel manager, Eliza had dealt with her fair share of troublemakers, unruly guests, and difficult situations. The arrogance of the elite, the spoiled rich who believed they could buy their way out of anything, Eliza knew them all. She had grown accustomed to their demands, their unspoken belief that their money granted them power over the world. But Bella had been different. There was something about the way she held herself, the confidence despite her shabby appearance, that rattled Eliza. She hadn't expected it, and it caught her off guard. Eliza, for all her authority, had a deep-seated fear of losing control. She had worked hard to get where she was. The hotel was her domain, and she had been careful to create an image of perfection and exclusivity. But Bella's defiance, her refusal to be invisible, threatened that carefully crafted image. Eliza could feel it, even now, that tightness in her chest as she recalled the encounter. She had only done what was necessary, hadn't she? A hotel like Orion Towers couldn't afford to be seen as a place where anyone could just show up and demand service. The customers who walked through those grand doors expected a certain standard, a certain caliber of guest. And Bella, for all her bravado, didn't fit that mold. But why did she feel so uncomfortable about it? As Eliza walked through the empty hallways of the hotel later that evening, her thoughts turned darker. What if Bella had been right? What if she had been unfair, too quick to judge? Eliza didn't want to admit it, but there was a part of her, small, but undeniable, that recognized the truth. She had been cruel. Bella hadn't done anything wrong. She had only asked for what she deserved, to be seen, to be acknowledged. Before Eliza could process her emotions further, a knock on her office door snapped her out of her thoughts. It was her assistant, who handed her a report on the hotel's current bookings. "Everything looks normal," Eliza said, her voice colder than she intended. "I'll look through it later." As the assistant left, Eliza felt a strange sense of unease in her chest, as though something was off but she couldn't quite place it. She tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow, following her every move. The next morning, as Eliza prepared to leave for work, the unease only grew. The hotel's polished marble floors and bright, pristine walls no longer felt like symbols of success. Instead, they felt like a fortress, one that she had spent years building, but that now seemed fragile, vulnerable to cracks she hadn't noticed before. Later that afternoon, Eliza found herself once again stepping into the emergency exit of the hotel, a habit she had grown accustomed to when she needed a moment of solitude. It was a quiet place, away from the prying eyes of the guests, where she could gather her thoughts. But as soon as she rounded the corner, she saw her. Bella. What was she doing here? Eliza froze, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected to see Bella again, certainly not so soon. The woman was standing in the dimly lit stairwell, her back turned, as though she were waiting for something. Eliza's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of panic rising in her chest. "What the hell are you doing here?" Eliza spat, her voice sharp with an edge of fear. "I told you to leave." Bella didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned slowly, her gaze cool and unwavering. Her eyes, now filled with an intensity that Eliza couldn't ignore, locked onto hers. There was no anger in Bella's expression, no signs of the outrage Eliza had expected. Instead, there was a quiet sense of purpose. "I'm not here to argue," Bella said, her voice low and calm. "I just need to get through. It's urgent." Eliza's chest tightened. "You don't belong here. Not in this hotel, not in this world. Now leave before I call security." Bella stepped forward, her body language unbothered. "I'm not leaving, Eliza," she said, her tone softening, though there was no mistaking the firmness behind her words. "Not this time." "Move," Eliza commanded, feeling the old rush of authority take hold of her. She stepped forward to block Bella from moving past her, unwilling to let the woman continue her silent rebellion. But Bella didn't stop. Instead, she tried to move around Eliza, attempting to push past her. In that moment, something inside Eliza snapped. She shoved Bella back, her hands landing on Bella's shoulders with force. Bella, taken by surprise, stumbled backward, her feet skidding on the polished floor. She tried to regain her balance, but the force of Eliza's push sent her tumbling down the stairwell. The impact was sickening, a loud thud that echoed through the empty corridor. Eliza's heart stopped as she watched Bella fall, helpless to do anything. She stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She didn't know what came over her. She never meant to hurt Bella. But the world around her seemed to collapse in that moment. She stared at the motionless form below, the silence in the stairwell pressing in on her chest like a vice. Panic gripped Eliza as she slowly made her way down the stairs, her feet heavy as though they didn't belong to her. She had never felt so small, so powerless. When she reached the bottom, she gasped in shock. Bella was lying there, motionless, a pool of blood spreading beneath her head. Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her, her breath quickening as the realization of what had just happened settled in. She didn't know what to do, where to go. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, louder than ever. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. Gemma. Gemma's eyes locked onto Eliza's, and for a moment, everything stood still. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Gemma's gaze was unreadable, but there was no denying the gravity in her eyes. Eliza opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, her heart hammering in her chest. Gemma didn't say anything either. She just stood there, staring at Eliza, the weight of what had just occurred hanging between them. The reckoning. The world felt muted as Eliza stood frozen at the bottom of the stairwell. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a thick fog, and her vision seemed to blur around the edges. She was standing over Bella, who lay motionless in a pool of blood, her body unnaturally still. The sight of it, the blood staining the gleaming floor, the way Bella's limbs twisted at odd angles, stirred something deep within Eliza. Something she wasn't prepared to confront. Gemma had stepped closer, her presence almost overwhelming in the suffocating silence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes were the only thing Eliza could focus on now, those dark, unwavering eyes that seemed to pierce through Eliza's own turmoil. Eliza's heart raced. Her breaths were shallow, quick. It felt like time had stopped, like she was trapped in some nightmarish moment where everything she'd done was closing in on her. The hotel's once perfect image was now cracked, shattered beyond repair. She had acted out of anger, out of fear, and now the consequences of her actions were staring her in the face. For a long moment, Eliza didn't move. Her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, unwilling to take the steps needed to assess the damage she had caused. It wasn't just Bella that was broken in that instant, it was Eliza's own image of herself, her self-worth. The person she had prided herself on being, the one who always had control, was slipping away. Finally, Gemma broke the silence, her voice low but firm. "What have you done?" Eliza's throat tightened, but she couldn't find the words to answer. How could she explain this? How could she justify her actions when she knew, deep down, that there was no excuse? "I didn't mean to," Eliza began, her voice cracking under the weight of guilt. She wouldn't listen. I lost control." Gemma shook her head, her face hardening with a quiet fury. "Lost control?" she repeated, almost mockingly. "You don't just lose control over someone's life. You pushed her, Eliza. You pushed her down those stairs. And now look at her." Eliza swallowed hard, the truth of it sinking deeper than anything she had ever felt. It wasn't just a small mistake. This was something much darker. It was violence. It was the kind of cruelty that could not be undone. Is she dead? Eliza whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion she didn't recognize. Her own words were foreign to her, as though they belonged to someone else. Gemma didn't answer immediately. She crouched down beside Bella's still form, checking for signs of life. Eliza watched, her chest tightening with each second that passed. There was no movement from Bella, no sign that she was breathing. "Eliza," Gemma finally said, her voice cold and steady. "You have to get help. Now." The urgency in Gemma's voice snapped Eliza into action. Without thinking, she rushed to the nearest phone, dialing emergency services with trembling hands. "Please, you have to send someone. A woman's been injured, badly. She needs help. Now." Her voice was panicked, frantic, but there was a part of her that couldn't even believe the words she was saying. As the dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, Eliza's mind raced. What had she done? Why had she acted like that? Why couldn't she have just let Bella leave, like she had asked? But no matter how much she replayed the events in her mind, the answer didn't change. Eliza had made a choice in that moment. A choice to exert power over someone she saw as less than, someone who didn't deserve to be in a place like Orion Towers. The shame, the guilt, and the anger at herself for having made that choice began to suffocate her. She didn't even know who she was anymore. She was no better than the people she had always looked down upon, the ones who treated others like they were invisible, dispensable. A siren echoed faintly in the distance, signaling the arrival of help. But it felt like an eternity before the paramedics finally reached them. Eliza stepped back, her legs weak, her body trembling from the overwhelming sense of guilt. Gemma stayed close to Bella, her eyes never leaving the motionless figure. Eliza watched as the paramedics rushed to Bella's side, carefully assessing her injuries. One of them turned to Eliza. "What happened?" he asked, his voice sharp. Eliza stammered. Her throat was dry, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. "I didn't mean for this to happen. She pushed past me. I pushed her back, and she fell." The paramedic's eyes narrowed slightly. "You pushed her?" Eliza nodded weakly, her gaze dropping to the ground. The paramedic's face hardened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he focused on Bella, directing the others to get her on a stretcher. Gemma stepped forward, her voice low and dangerous. "I don't think you understand what you've done, Eliza. This isn't just some little mistake. This is assault. She could have died. And if she does, it'll be on you." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Her chest constricted, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't thought of it that way, had she? She hadn't thought about the gravity of the situation until now. Bella's body was carefully lifted onto the stretcher, and Eliza watched, helpless, as the paramedics hurried her away. Gemma turned to Eliza, her face as stern as a stone wall. "You can't undo this. You can't change what you've done. But you can take responsibility. You can make it right," Gemma said, her voice low but filled with unshakable conviction. "You can start by telling the truth." Eliza's head spun with the weight of Gemma's words. Tell the truth. That was the only way forward now, wasn't it? The only way to begin to repair the damage she had caused. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, legal consultations, and endless questions. The media picked up the story quickly. Eliza's role in the incident became a subject of intense scrutiny. Bella, however, remained unconscious for much of it, her condition too critical for her to give a statement. The world was watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. Eliza had resigned herself to the inevitable. The truth would come out. And when it did, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. There was no escaping it. But even as she stood at the precipice of everything she had built crumbling, a small, nagging part of her realized that Gemma had been right. She could never undo the past, but she could choose how to move forward. Eliza had been the one to push Bella, but it was also Eliza who had the power to rebuild what had been broken, not just within the hotel, but within herself, the awakening. The days following the incident blurred into an overwhelming rush of legal consultations, media coverage, and tense hospital visits. Bella had remained in critical condition for almost a week, her life hanging by a thread. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, her body seemed to be resisting recovery. Eliza's thoughts were consumed with guilt, and the weight of the situation pressed down on her at all times. She could barely focus on anything else. Her colleagues at the hotel had started to treat her differently. There were whispers in the halls, knowing glances, and a cold distance that hadn't been there before. Eliza, once the epitome of control and authority, now felt like a shadow of herself. Every time she walked through the hotel's pristine halls, it was as though the walls themselves were closing in on her, reminding her of the horrors she had caused. But it was the moment she found herself standing outside Bella's hospital room that Eliza truly began to understand the magnitude of her actions. It was early morning when Eliza arrived at the hospital, still shaken by the events of the last few days. The reporters had left for the night, but there was still a lingering sense of media frenzy outside. The walls were adorned with flowers and cards, tributes from well-wishers, from those who had read Bella's story in the press and felt compelled to send their love. Eliza stood outside the room for several minutes, unsure if she was ready to face Bella, unsure if Bella even remembered what had happened. Finally, after a deep breath, Eliza pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her made her stomach churn. Bella lay in the bed, a pale shadow of her former self. Her face was bruised, her body wrapped in bandages, and there were tubes and machines connected to her, keeping her alive. Her eyes were closed, and for a moment, Eliza wondered if Bella would even recognize her. "Miss Davis?" Eliza's voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. There was no immediate response. Bella's shallow breathing was the only indication that she was still alive. Eliza swallowed hard, trying to steady her emotions. She was about to turn away, but then, to her shock, Bella's eyes flickered open. There was a long, quiet moment as their gazes met. Bella's eyes were dark and full of pain, but there was something else there too, a deep sense of understanding, perhaps even a trace of defiance. Bella didn't say anything at first, but her expression spoke volumes. She knew who was standing before her. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She hadn't planned on saying anything, but the words felt like they needed to be said, like they were the only way she could begin to acknowledge the pain she had caused. "I'm so sorry." Bella remained silent for a long time. She blinked slowly, as though processing the apology, but there was no immediate forgiveness in her eyes. Instead, there was something deeper, something that Eliza couldn't quite decipher. "You pushed me," Bella's voice was raspy, but clear enough for Eliza to hear. "You pushed me, and I fell." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow, and for a moment, she felt dizzy. She wanted to apologize again, to beg for forgiveness, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Instead, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of her guilt crash down on her like an avalanche. "I never meant to hurt you," Eliza said quietly, her voice trembling. I was afraid. I didn't know how to handle it. I was angry." Bella's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a small flicker of emotion crossed her face. "Afraid?" she repeated. "Of me? Why? I wasn't the one who pushed you around." Eliza flinched, her heart aching with the realization that Bella was right. She had allowed her own fears, her own prejudices, to dictate her actions. She had let the fear of losing control, of losing her authority, drive her to violence. It wasn't Bella who had been threatening, it had been Eliza's own fragile sense of self that had been under threat. Bella had been nothing more than a reflection of everything Eliza was afraid to face about herself. I was afraid of losing my place, Eliza admitted, the words tasting bitter as they left her mouth. Afraid that someone like you, someone who didn't belong in a place like this, would come in and disrupt everything I had built. There was a long pause, and Bella's gaze softened, just slightly. She didn't respond immediately, but the change in her expression was enough for Eliza to know that, at least for a moment, she understood. I'm not here to disrupt anything, Bella said, her voice still soft but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. I'm just here to be seen. To be treated like everyone else. I've had to fight for everything in my life, Eliza. And I'm tired of fighting. The words lingered in the air long after Bella had spoken them. They were raw, vulnerable, and honest in a way that Eliza had never been able to express. Bella wasn't just asking for forgiveness. She was asking for something deeper, a recognition of her humanity, her right to exist and be treated with dignity. And in that moment, Eliza knew that she had never truly seen Bella before. For the first time, Eliza realized how much her privilege had clouded her perception of the world. She had been so focused on her own power, her own status, that she had failed to see the people around her for who they truly were. And it wasn't just Bella. Eliza had treated so many people like that, without even realizing it. Her authority had been a shield, protecting her from having to face the uncomfortable truth about herself. But now, in the quiet of the hospital room, with Bella's words hanging in the air, Eliza couldn't deny it any longer. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Eliza whispered, the weight of her guilt heavy in her chest. But I need to make things right. I need to change. For you, for everyone. Bella's eyes studied Eliza for a moment before she nodded slowly. There was no forgiveness in her gaze, not yet. But there was understanding, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. Eliza's decision to confront her past wasn't something that happened overnight. It took weeks of reflection, self-examination, and facing the fallout of her actions. She found herself visiting the hospital regularly, not just to check on Bella, but to force herself to reckon with the reality of what she had done. She had already started taking steps to change. She initiated conversations with the hotel's board about implementing new diversity and inclusion policies. She called for staff-wide sensitivity training, vowing to never let another person be treated the way Bella had been. It was a long, difficult road, but it was one she was willing to walk, no matter how painful the journey. It was also during this time that Eliza began to reconcile her relationship with herself. The woman she had been, the one who had relied on her position of power, who had used her authority to belittle and dismiss others, wasn't the woman she wanted to be anymore. She began to understand the fragility of power, and how easily it could corrupt. But redemption wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed. It would take years of consistent action, of proving herself, of earning the trust that she had shattered. But at least now, Eliza was ready to face the long road ahead. And maybe, just maybe, one day, Bella would be ready to forgive her. The change. Weeks turned into months, and Eliza's life had become a continuous cycle of self-reflection, confrontation with her past actions, and attempts at making things right. The incident with Bella had completely altered the course of her life, and while the physical scars were fading, the emotional ones were still raw. Eliza had thrown herself into her work at the hotel, but now, it wasn't just about keeping the guests happy or maintaining the luxury and perfection of the Orion Towers, it was about earning back the respect she had lost, not just from the people around her, but from herself. Her mornings began early, and each day was filled with meetings, phone calls, and a series of difficult decisions. But the tasks she once tackled with ease had taken on new meaning. Every action, every conversation, was weighed heavily with the knowledge that she had broken something fundamental in herself. It was like trying to rebuild a fragile structure, one brick at a time, knowing that it would never be the same again. But for the first time in years, Eliza felt the weight of her own moral compass pulling her toward change. The hotel, too, began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Eliza had instituted diversity training for all staff, ensuring that every person working at the Orion Towers was educated on implicit bias and racism. The initial resistance had been palpable, with some employees openly questioning the necessity of such measures. But Eliza stood firm, using her position not to enforce a sense of superiority, but to foster inclusivity, respect, and understanding. She knew that if the hotel was ever to truly change, she had to set the example, even if that meant discomfort. But it wasn't enough just to implement policies. Eliza knew that real change had to start within herself. She had to confront her own biases, the deeply ingrained prejudices that she had carried with her for so long. She couldn't just be the manager of the Orion Towers anymore, she had to become someone worthy of the title. Someone who lived by the values she wanted to instill in others. To do this, she began to spend time outside the hotel, immersing herself in the community she had so often ignored. She visited local businesses, met with community leaders, and began speaking at events focused on social justice and racial equality. The more she listened, the more she began to realize the depth of the injustice in the world, and her role in perpetuating it. For too long, Eliza had lived in a bubble, unaware of the struggles others faced. But now, she was learning. She was opening her eyes to the world outside of the gilded walls of Orion Towers. Despite her efforts, Eliza knew the road to redemption wouldn't be easy. Every day was a battle, not just with the people around her, but with herself. Every time she thought she had made progress, something would happen, an interaction, a memory, a comment. That would make her question if she was truly changing or if she was just putting on a mask. She wrestled with her old fears, the ones that told her she had to control everything, that she had to maintain her power. But no matter how many times the doubts crept in, Eliza refused to give up. She had started something, and she wasn't about to let it falter. One afternoon, several months after the incident, Eliza was sitting in her office when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Eliza?" She looked up to see Gemma standing in the doorway. The woman had become a quiet presence in Eliza's life, someone who had seen her at her lowest and still chosen to stay. Gemma had been there during the toughest days, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet understanding that had allowed Eliza to process her guilt and shame at her own pace. "Gemma," Eliza said, standing up. "I wasn't expecting you today. What's going on?" Gemma stepped inside, her expression neutral but thoughtful. "I wanted to talk to you about something. About the changes here at the hotel." Eliza felt a slight flutter in her chest. Despite everything she had worked on, Gemma's opinion still held weight in her heart. "Is everything okay?" Eliza asked, her voice tinged with concern. Gemma didn't immediately respond. She glanced around the office, at the framed photos of various charity events Eliza had attended, the new employee diversity posters on the walls, the pile of reports Eliza had been reviewing. "You've been doing good work, Eliza," Gemma said finally, her voice steady. "I know it hasn't been easy, and I know a lot of people still look at you sideways, but I can see the changes. You've made the hotel a better place for everyone." Eliza nodded, her heart tightening. "I'm trying. But I still don't know if I've done enough. I still feel like I'm not there yet." Gemma smiled slightly, a knowing glint in her eyes. Change doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen all at once. But you've taken responsibility, and that's more than most people ever do. Eliza felt a lump in her throat, her emotions threatening to spill over. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she whispered. "Not from you, not from anyone." Gemma stepped closer, her gaze softening. "You're right. You don't deserve forgiveness, not yet. But that doesn't mean you won't earn it. Not from me, and not from anyone else." Eliza felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She had known all along that her redemption would be a long, slow process, but hearing Gemma acknowledge it in this way was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. "Thank you," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still learning, Gemma. And I know I have a long way to go. But I'm not going to stop." Weeks later, Eliza found herself in a familiar place, the lobby of the Orion Towers Hotel. This time, though, the atmosphere felt different. The air was filled with a subtle sense of change, as though the very walls of the hotel were beginning to reflect the new values that Eliza had worked so hard to instill. The staff was more engaged, the guests were more diverse, and there was a renewed sense of warmth in the air. But as Eliza walked through the lobby, she was met with the eyes of someone she hadn't seen in months, Bella. Bella stood at the front desk, a small suitcase by her side, her posture still radiating strength despite the physical scars she carried. She had been in and out of the hospital, recovering from her injuries, and Eliza hadn't seen her in person for a while. Her heart skipped a beat as their gazes met across the room. Bella's face was unreadable, but there was no anger in her eyes. No judgment. Instead, there was something else, something that Eliza hadn't dared hope for, understanding. Eliza took a tentative step toward Bella, her heart pounding in her chest. "Bella," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I wanted to tell you again how sorry I am. For everything." Bella didn't immediately respond. She just looked at Eliza for a long moment, her expression guarded, but there was no longer any animosity. No resentment. Instead, Bella nodded slowly. "I've seen the changes you've made, Eliza," Bella said, her voice quiet but steady. "And I'm glad. I'm glad you've taken responsibility for what you did. But it's going to take time for me to forgive you. And for me to forgive myself." Eliza nodded, understanding the weight of those words. It wasn't forgiveness she needed right now, it was time. Time to prove that she was capable of change, and time for Bella to heal from the trauma that had been inflicted upon her. "I'm willing to give you that time," Eliza said quietly. "I will keep working. I'll keep learning. And maybe, someday, we can rebuild what was broken." Bella's eyes softened. "We'll see," she replied. Eliza watched as Bella walked away, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still many challenges ahead, and the road to redemption was far from over. But as Eliza stood there, watching Bella disappear into the crowd, she knew one thing for certain: change was possible, and she was ready to fight for it, no matter how long it took. The resolution. The weeks following Bella's return to the hotel marked a turning point for Eliza. Although there was still tension in the air, a subtle shift was evident. The hotel, once a fortress of luxury and exclusivity, had started to reflect the change that Eliza had worked so hard to instill. The days of treating people as less than because of their social status, race, or appearance were slowly fading away. Staff training was ongoing, and employees, once skeptical of Eliza's new policies, had begun to come around. The air was lighter now, less oppressive, and Eliza had made a point to speak to everyone individually, sharing her commitment to making the hotel a place of real inclusivity, not just in practice, but in spirit. But the transformation wasn't only taking place within the hotel. For Eliza, it was a constant process. Every interaction, every conversation was another opportunity to prove that she had changed. The woman who had once reveled in her position of power, who had dismissed people based on their social status, was now learning to listen. She was learning to give respect, not as something earned but as a fundamental right, something that every person deserved, regardless of the circumstances they were born into. Still, there were challenges ahead. The media had latched onto the story of Bella's fall, and the attention hadn't died down. Bella's name was now synonymous with the fight for equality and against discrimination, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Eliza's role in the incident had become an uncomfortable truth that people continued to scrutinize. Some saw her efforts to change as genuine, but others, especially those from her past, continued to question her sincerity. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting with the hotel's board of directors, Eliza found herself sitting alone in her office, gazing out at the skyline. Her mind was swirling with doubts again. Was she really making a difference? Could she truly change the culture of a place so entrenched in exclusivity and privilege? She had been working tirelessly to correct her wrongs, but deep down, she still feared she would never be enough. The sound of the door opening broke her thoughts. She turned to see Gemma standing in the doorway, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Mind if I come in?" Gemma asked. Eliza waved her hand, inviting Gemma in. "Of course, Gemma. What's going on?" "I just wanted to check in," Gemma said, taking a seat in the chair across from Eliza. "How's everything going with the board?" Eliza sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's been difficult. They're skeptical. Some of them think the changes I'm implementing are just a phase, something that will blow over once the media stops paying attention." Gemma tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in thought. "And what do you think?" Eliza paused. "I think they're right, in a way. I'm not naive enough to think everything will be easy. The hotel's culture runs deep. But I also know that if I don't keep pushing, nothing will ever change. And I can't go back to the way things were. I want to make things right." Gemma's gaze softened, her voice calm but firm. "You're on the right path, Eliza. You've done more in these past months than most people will ever do in their entire lives. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. And you've made a lot of it." Eliza looked at Gemma, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you. I've been so focused on doing the right things, I sometimes forget to give myself credit for how far I've come." Gemma leaned forward slightly. "You've made mistakes. We all have. But the difference now is that you're willing to face them, to own them. That's what matters." Eliza sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the past few months lifting slightly. She had been so consumed with doubt, with trying to fix everything at once, that she hadn't stopped to reflect on how much had changed. She had done the hard work, and that was something no one could take away from her. The following week, Eliza took a trip to the local community center, an outreach program that Bella had been actively involved in since her recovery. Bella had invited Eliza to speak at one of their events, and though Eliza had initially hesitated, she realized that this was a crucial moment for her. She had to face the people she had wronged, especially Bella, and show them that she was truly committed to making a change. When Eliza arrived at the community center, Bella was already there, standing near the entrance with a few other guests. Her presence was commanding, but there was an undeniable warmth in the way she interacted with the crowd. She was no longer the victim of the incident, she was a beacon of hope and strength, someone who had turned her pain into power. Eliza felt a wave of nervousness wash over her, but she pushed it aside. She wasn't here for herself, she was here to make amends. Bella saw her first, and for a moment, the two of them stood there, silently acknowledging the distance they had come. "Thank you for coming," Bella said, her voice steady but kind. "I know this isn't easy." Eliza nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make things right, Bella. And I'll keep fighting for change, for you, for everyone." Bella studied her for a long moment before giving a small nod. "I know you will. Just don't forget that actions speak louder than words." Eliza smiled, feeling the weight of Bella's words settle in her chest. She had a long road ahead of her, but Bella's forgiveness wasn't something she expected to earn quickly. It would take time, and Eliza was willing to wait. Later that evening, as Eliza stood at the back of the room during the event, watching Bella speak to the crowd with such confidence, Eliza's heart swelled with pride. This was what true strength looked like, standing tall in the face of adversity, turning pain into purpose. Bella had shown Eliza that change wasn't just about correcting one mistake, it was about shifting the way you saw the world, the way you treated others, and the way you held yourself accountable. When the event ended, Bella approached Eliza again. This time, there was a different energy between them, something softer, something more genuine. "You've come a long way, Eliza," Bella said quietly. "But remember, it's not about the apology anymore. It's about showing up, every day. Proving that you can be trusted to do the right thing." Eliza nodded, her heart full. "I will. I promise." As they walked out of the community center together, Eliza felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't perfect. She had made mistakes, and she would continue to make them. But she was no longer afraid to face them. She had done the work to earn back her integrity, to earn her place in this world, not as someone above others, but as someone who could stand beside them in the fight for justice. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time, Eliza believed it was possible.